Welcome to Zero Velocity. I'm your host, Brad Thorpe.
So today we're going to talk about isometrics for sports performance. Everyone wants to get a little bit better. And when you're dealing with elite athletes, a little bit better is the difference between coming 100th in the world and first. So we're about to fill in that gap of how do you find that competitive edge over your competitor. You know, you talk about 100-meter sprint performance. One thing you never talk about is the isometric start, right? They're all lined up at the starting blocks. They got to all hold isometric before they take off. And these guys are generating huge amounts of force, huge amounts of power. Olympic weightlifters, do you think they start moving? They don't. They start in an isometric contraction and ramp up huge amounts of tension and then explode into their lift. Pretty much every athlete on the planet requires huge amounts of isometric strength. Water polo players, right? When they're coming up out of the water, their legs are going up. They're kicking. But if their trunk fails, they can't generate huge amounts of force. Now, here's one thing that most people never consider when discussing isometric muscle contractions. In 100% of every scenario that we deal with as humans, the muscular system fires isometrically first, then responds either concentrically or eccentrically, depending on the direction you guys are moving. And that's why what we're talking about and what we're trying to accomplish at Isophit with zero velocity is so vital for you guys as athletes. Because sure, it's fun. We like playing sport, but we also really like winning. And more so, we enjoy not being hurt along the way. So what I want to dive into today is really some of the science, not a huge amount of the science, just basically I want to craft a story for you guys that sort of says, hey, maybe I should be considering adding isometric strength training as a unique component to your strength and conditioning programs for your athletes, and if you're an athlete, for your own training program. So what we're going to do is we're just going to massage this story a little bit. We're going to give you a little bit of the science first. Then we're going to jump into, some of the successes that I've had as, a strength and performance coach. We're going to talk about some of the successes of some of our athletes that we've helped influence over the last several years through their training processes. We're going to leave out their names because, athletes do like their competitive advantage. But it's been pretty awesome. So we can sort of pull up our first slide here, and this is from the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. And it's going way back to 2007, so it's a little bit older. So explosive isometric training has been shown to provide similar benefits to that of plyometric training with respect to measured variables, but with the reduced impact forces, and therefore provide a useful adjunct for athletic training programs. So why is that important? Well, one of the things that we have to consider when we're dealing with athletes, we want them to show up on game day without injury, without joint inflammation, without aches and pains. Man, can you imagine if you're an athlete and that actually happened? Wow. Imagine your performance. It'd probably go up. Those injuries over the course of a year just stack up. And a lot of the injuries, they don't actually happen on the field. They happen in the gym. Which, if you've listened to some of our previous podcasts, you know how I feel about athletes getting injured in gyms or people getting injured in gyms. I think it's negligent. I think it should, in theory, be the most controlled environment. Obviously, there's going to be an element of risk, but we can mitigate that risk through using explosive isometrics versus plyometrics. I'm not going to jump up and down on my chair this week, so I'm going to save my team back there, going all frantic, going, "Oh, Brad's out of frame." So what we're going to do, though, what I want you to think about is the next time you go to implement a plyometric into your training protocol, think about adding an explosive isometric. And what we got to define that's an explosive muscle contraction generating huge amounts of tension with less than a second contraction, right? So it's like generating huge amounts of tension without moving. Now, if you do that over multiple angles, some of the research, so we'll pull up our next little slide here. Wow, my slides are so out of whack here. So I'm going to just jump down. Did I delete my slide? I totally deleted my slide. So that's okay. You guys listening on Spotify, you can't see it anyways. There's my slide. So anyways, in conclusion, training isometrically at 4 angles produced significantly greater gains in isometric strength across a range of angles. And it was 18% versus 13.1% when you compare the isometric component to the dynamic component. But similar gains in dynamic strength at 10.5 isometrically in comparison to in the dynamic component was 10.7. So if you're an athlete, if you're going to get similar benefits in 10.5 and 10.7, let's be honest, that's basically the exact same. But if you can add an element to like the isometric strength that is like 5% greater. If you're 5% better than your competitor, well, chances are you're going to win every time. Who doesn't want that? That's millions of dollars for some of you basketball athletes, sprinters, stuff like that. Whatever sport you play, when you're dealing with a 5% improvement over your competition, you win. High probability you also end up injured less. You can create this legacy style career, which is pretty important. And because I have no idea where my slides are, I'm just going to go back here. There we go. And one thing that we want to do is discuss change of direction. How important is that for athletes, right? So when we're looking at how do you get by your opponent? And it doesn't matter if you're talking about soccer, basketball, football, ice hockey. What matters is, do you have the ability to react on demand, fire transfer force in a different direction without having your torso or your limb still move in one direction? You have to have that isometric component. So how a muscle contraction works. It starts isometrically. It ramps up through the concentric phase. Then you go through this negative acceleration phase. Some people call that deceleration, right? And it comes back to 0 speed in order to transition from left to right, right to left. So you start at 0, accelerate, decelerate, stop, get back out of that. So you have multiple components of that movement or that contraction that is isometric. The start, the transitional phase of all human motion is isometric, and then you get out. And I know there's going to be a lot of people out there that says, well, it's about that stretch, strength or stretch shortening, drawing a blank, stretch shortening cycle. And there's really no stretch. There really isn't. It's actually just basically just going to isometrics, and it's just changing direction, going the opposite way. So we have to think about that. We have to focus on what's really happening on a muscular perspective. Muscles are fixed at a defined length. It's almost like an extension ladder. A 12-foot ladder that, you basically get and you carry around at 6 feet long. So you have that ability to extend, but that extension ladder will go from 6 feet to 12 feet. And it'll vary between 6 and 12 feet. When I'm going from 6 to 12, it didn't stretch. As much as you want to think it did, it got longer, it elongated, but because you have a fixed defined endpoint, that extension ladder will never get longer than 12 feet. So we have to start thinking about that when we're looking at muscle structure. And how do we avoid injuring our athletes trying to maybe grab and pull and twist and do all this extreme stretching that may influence things that are not named muscle. Things like tendon structure, ligaments, nerves, arteries, veins, skin. Did we want those loose? Did we want to loosen the joint capsule? Did we want to stretch the joint capsule? So there's a massive difference between functioning at an optimal level and damaging tissue. Like if I have my underwear band, and I'll just do this for fun. So if I keep pulling and stretching on this stuff, what happens to it? Does it start to get better? No, it breaks down. So the cool part about elastic quality is not about stretching. It's actually about restoration. So if I let this go, what arm is that? There we go. So if I pull that out, I can guarantee you this is not going to shoot to the left. It's 100% predictable that it's going to shoot into my body. Want to do that? Oh, look, let's do it again. So 100% predictability, if I can do that all day long, this is absolutely amazing. Now, the only reason that will break down and I lose predictability is because I'm going to stretch this elastic element into a plastic state, meaning it doesn't function the same. So we as trainers and strength coaches and athletes really need to understand what is happening with our tissues. And then you go, well, look at gymnastics. Look at ballerinas. Look at all these dancers that stretch and stretch and stretch. Yeah, they do. And guess what? They're often injured. And they're often seriously injured. And it's not necessarily during their career, it's post-career when they're no longer dedicating the same amount of time to their training. Because the muscular system has that contractility or that ability to cause compression. And that's what it does. It holds you together. Muscles, as they get stronger, that natural tone of muscle tissue causes greater levels of compression. So when your career ends and you're no longer training 30 hours a week, you're no longer participating in your games X number of hours a week, the muscular system starts to degrade, it starts to get weaker, your ability to generate tension within your structure goes down. Now, what happens when that tension goes down? Those ligaments and tendon structures that you've spent years trying to stretch, which is the elongation of stuff, also a thinning of the material, a degradation of that material, no longer does its job. And you end up injured. You end up tearing something. You end up with chronic pain. And if you're a retired athlete, you know what I'm talking about. If you're an 18-year-old to 29-year-old athlete, you don't really know what I'm talking about yet because your physicality is still kind of growing. But when you get to a specific age, it's usually around 27 to 32, you start to actually shrink. You start to get smaller as a human. That means that my tight pants are starting to picking up slack. So if I pick up some slack in there, what happens is now when the muscle contracts, I have to pick up that slack in that tendon structure in order to transmit force to that bone. Now, if you think about that for a second, so if a tendon sort of amalgamates into that bone and basically forms what's called the periosteum, which is the outermost surface of that bone structure. So that's what the interrelationship of that osteotendinous junction is, which is that tendon going into the bone, which is that osteum or basically your bone structure. So that muscle contracts, pulls on the tendon transmits force to the bone. So if there's slack or looseness within that stretchy or that tendon structure, you lose the ability to generate force. Now with aging as an athlete, we've spent years stretching because that's what we thought we were supposed to do. That's why people get injured later, because they did spend a lot of time stretching tissues not named muscle. They stretched tendons, ligaments, arteries, as well as your veins and stuff. But not here to really talk about that. We're here to talk about optimizing performance. So if I can increase that neural signal from my central nervous system, be it my brain, to that muscle, and we're talking thousandths of seconds, right? That impulse travels in the hundreds of miles per hour. And 100 miles an hour, in my 6-foot body is pretty damn fast. Stretching impairs that signal. So it dampens it. It doesn't work as well. It may inhibit muscle function, so it doesn't stabilize. It doesn't react as quick. Interestingly, isometric-based training actually increases the activation rate of that tissue. Now, here's an interesting thing when I look at the activation of tissue. So I'm just going to pull that up there. So the mean activation levels during maximum eccentric and maximal concentric contractions were 88.3 and 89.7% respectively, and were significantly lower with respect to maximum isometric contractions. They measured in at 95.2%. So if we're worried about reaction time, change of direction, all of this other stuff, we got to add this component to our training. In addition to neurology, as well as the strength component, we have to think about how isometrics plays into performance. How do you generate force from one region to the next? Like if I'm a baseball athlete and I'm swinging, how is your grip? How is your footing? Did you have the ability to hold? Because you don't necessarily know when that baseball pitcher is actually going to throw the ball. They have a specific amount of time and you got to kind of stand in the box and wait. You shift around a little bit and you're kind of like, okay, come on, buddy, throw the damn ball. But then you basically have to react, so it's that instant tension generation, which is the isometric component, right? You don't just sit there and it's not all floppy like this and then you try to, you tense up and then you swing, right? In order to generate huge amounts of tension, that isometric component is so relevant. And if you're not training it, you're guessing, hoping, and praying that it's going to get better and it's going to work. It's not always the case. And one thing that we have to think about is reaction time, right? And here we look at, so results indicate that isometric mid-thigh pull variables are significantly associated with the 20-meter sprint kinematics. Specifically, isometric mid-thigh pull rate of force development appears to be related to the initial acceleration kinetics of a sprint. Strength and conditioning professionals can possibly implement the isometric mid-thigh pull for improved assessment and monitoring of athletic performance and training. And that's the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research, and that's 2008-17. So it's relatively recent. But more so, from a testing perspective, having that insight into your athlete is hugely important. Now, one thing I will scream at the top of my lungs about. The mid-thigh pull, as great as it is one specific position in space. Humans are capable of doing billions of things. So it's relevant? Absolutely. Can it predict some stuff? Sure. Should you train more positions and increase the positional strength throughout multiple ranges? Absolutely. So don't just get pigeonholed in thinking that mid-thigh isometric pulls are the best thing on the face of the planet, because it's good, it has a purpose, but there's other things that you guys want to measure. And there's a ton of stuff you can sit and measure, right? So here's kind of cool, the relationship between maximum isometric strength and ball velocity in a tennis serve. And I'm just jumping around from sports, right? So we've talked a little bit about basketball and soccer and jumping and sprint performance and stuff like that. Here we're talking about tennis, and a massive shout out to the Canadian team tennis program. You guys are kicking butt. You're what you guys did at team, basically the U.S. Olympic, or not the Olympics, the U.S. Open this past weekend was phenomenal. So kudos to you. And it was a lady from Toronto who did win. Yay. So love it, all this young talent. But here we go. The maximum isometric strength levels in shoulder internal rotation was strongly related to serve velocity. And a large part of the variability in serve velocity was explained by the maximum isometric strength levels in shoulder internal rotation and flexion strength. So you got to get up there. So that's flexion. And then as you come across, as you sort of turn over that racket, it's internal rotation. So if I'm looking at it maximizing my velocity on a tennis serve, well, here's some literature that says, let's consider adding some isometric-based strength training. You could basically take this same information, you could extrapolate that to other sort of overhead sports, whether it's badminton, whether it's tennis, whether it's volleyball, whether it's swimming. Hold on, swimming is an overhead sport? Yes, it is, right? We don't think about that even though we're always up here. So we're able to think about, well, what can happen from a strength and stability, my shoulder complex, right? So you have that shoulder blade, so your scapula and your basically your humerus, and then you get what's called your glenoid GH joint, glenohumeral joint. So that basically sort of, it's like a ball, like on really kind of like almost like similar to golf. You got your golf tee and you got a golf ball. So what it is basically sits there. So if you lack isometric strength, think in terms of if I lack the ability to hold my structure together, maybe the performance is going to go down. So something to consider. Also, we jump over here. Here's another thing sort of celebrating the benefit of mid-thigh. So the isometric mid-thigh pull provides an efficient method for assessing isometric strength in athletes. This measure also provides a strong indication of dynamic performance in Division I football players. So we just left the sport of tennis, which you would never sort of look at a tennis athlete and say, hey, tennis, and then you wouldn't think to put them next to a football player in Division I. I mean, these guys are like absolutely gigantic human beings. And it's pretty interesting when you look at that and you go, well, if it provides a strong indication of dynamic performance, and we've already looked at some of the other stuff, just add it. And here's what I want you guys to truly understand. Dynamic exercise is the practice of movement. Isometric exercise is the preparation for movement. Now let's think about that. So if I only ever train dynamic movement, think about all the things that you may compensate with. Did you only practice the motor skill? And it's important to practice motor skill. And I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying add the preparation phase, right? So you can look at it, preparation for movement. You could change it because you're athletes, preparation for training. But then it usually gets sort of put over in the wayside saying, well, I'm already prepared. I'm already an athlete. Think in terms that isometrics is a way to maximize your performance as an athlete. It's also a way to maximize injury prevention as an athlete. And it's also a way to maximize your financial return as an athlete. Because you're looking at millions of dollars now if you're a quality athlete. And especially with the new change in the NCAA regulations, you're able to look at it and go, oh, I can basically, now it's not about just getting a scholarship. It's about making millions of dollars as a collegiate athlete because of the use of my likeness. That's pretty cool, right? So you can be an 18-year-old kid. You don't have to go directly to the NBA or anything. You can go make some pretty good coin in the NCAA. So here's a thing. So we went from tennis to football. We're going to jump back to baseball all of a sudden. So the results of this bivariate correlation suggests that a few strong statistical significant relationships occur between isometric force production characteristics and baseball offensive performance do occur. Partially supporting the hypothesis, specifically isometric rate of force development seems to produce the strongest relationships to doubles, slugging percentage, and home runs. Cool. If you're a baseball athlete, doubles, slugging percentage, and also home runs matter. So we know that from an offensive perspective, if overhead velocity and force generation is one area, right? I can be a pitcher, I can be a second baseman, I can also be an outfielder. So throwing is going to be improved by adding isometrics, and specifically to that flexion and internal rotation. Now we're looking at how do we look at trunk rotation and what is that relationship to home runs, doubles, and obviously slugging percentage. These guys get paid millions of dollars for missing 70% of their pitches or batting or basically getting out. So those are things that we got to think about. If I can get 5% better, 10% better, 20% better. Now here's some cool stuff. So the results suggest that explosive force production during isometric squats was associated with athletic performance. So remember that isometric or explosive isometric is that rapid generation of muscle tension without changing that joint position. Now, I do highly recommend doing explosive isometrics at multiple positions throughout a range that is similar to whatever the athletic position, movement pattern looks like. So developing maximum isometric muscle strength, practice the skill of the activity that you want to accomplish. If you're a triathlete, maybe playing basketball is not the best thing for you. If you're a basketball player, maybe doing triathlon is not the best thing for you. Now, the interesting thing is, if you do isometrics, it seems based off a lot of the research that is currently out there, that isometrics is the one thing that transfers over to absolutely every sporting activity out there. So when we talk about transfer, what do I mean? I mean, I'm going to go to the gym, training center, facility, at-home, backyard, basement, whatever you want to call it, and I'm going to do an activity with the sole goal of transferring over to my sport or activity. Got to practice that. So if I'm looking at rate of force development, having a better nervous system or better functioning nervous system is going to transfer over. If I'm looking at maximum muscle strength and contractility, that's going to transfer over. If I can withstand inertial effects or impact forces coming into my body, if I'm a hockey, football player, basketball athlete, that's going to have a direct impact. These are things that we have to start to think about. Now, what I want you guys to focus on over the next couple weeks, where you would traditionally add a stretch for your chest or your hamstring or your quad or your back, try to replace that with an isometric muscle contraction, right? So if you're looking at horizontal abduction, pulling that arm straight across towards that opposite shoulder, just don't grab with your opposite hand and pull it. Just brace it and squeeze into it. Try to fire up that chest. Don't do that traditional hamstring stretch of throwing your foot up on a table or a bench and reaching down towards it. Try to hold the leg in space. Try to get the muscles that would actually flex your hip and straighten your leg stronger. Because when you start to degrade the tissues that create stability in your body, your performance degrades. It gets worse. It puts yourself at absolute increased risk of injury. So what I want to sort of conclude with today is do your damn isometrics, people. Peace out. We'll see you next week when we talk about isometrics for some neurodegeneration of your brain.